My name is Kaleonani Hurley. I'm a PhD student in the zoology department at UH Manoa. My advisor is Rob Tonin, and together we're working on a project that we call Crabbing and Connectivity. And the basics of our project was inspired by some of the fabulous work being done with various lokoia or Hawaiian fish ponds across the state. So there are a number of different fish ponds. There were a few hundred in traditional historical times, and to this date, a lot of them are becoming more interesting because there's a lot of research being done there, but also because people are looking more towards figuring out how to grow resources locally. So with these ancient systems, we also have modern challenges. So some of this includes things like nutrient enrichment, which is a result of habitat being changed, land being changed closer to the shore. There's another issue with having to restock some of the various fish pond stocks of creatures. It also requires continuous care, just like it did back in the day. And it's also been used as a way to reconnect with traditional management practices for Native Hawaiians. So this is just one example of a modern management challenge. So what we see here in this mustard colored field is actually an entire bloom of these upside down jellyfish. And so as you can imagine, because they're jellyfish, they're very hazardous for creatures that live in this environment. But if we take a deeper look at the words lokoia, if you break apart the meaning, a loko is typically some kind of pond. It can be freshwater all the way up to saltwater. And ia, in modern times, we tend to think of with fish, but in traditional meaning, ia also refers to any marine creature. So as you can see, for the purpose of our research, this also includes things like crabs, such as the one that I have here circled on this makaha. Now, one of the reasons why we're interested in looking at crabs is because they provide a number of different services for the environments in which they live. For example, you may have heard of the coral guard crab, which protects the coral host from any creatures that try to destroy it. We also have crabs that are really good at sort of being like the cleaners of the sea, where they'll just go after whatever they find on the seafloor and clean up. And then we also have crabs that are capable of manipulating and eating macroalgae. But a big reason why we're interested in looking at crabs is because they're delicious and edible. And so here I have just a few examples of some of the crabs that were traditionally and currently consumed. Just a small sample, there were hundreds. And what you'll notice about the divisions I've made here is that the two crabs on the top are shore crabs. So these are ones that we typically see either running around on the rocks, and they spend some of their time in the water and some of their time out of the water. But the ones at the bottom we see as swimming crabs, and so they have different adaptations that allow them to be a little bit more mobile in the water, such as these really large paddles for their back feet. Hence why we call them swimming crabs. Questions that we are investigating for this work. The first is, what are the traditional management practices for our target crab species, and how can they be supported today? Also, are fish ponds self-seeding, or are they well connected to surrounding coastal waters? And I'll get a little bit more detail. So we have two target species for this. The first is Kuahonu, or Kuahonu. This is a local endemic. It was consumed historically and is still consumed currently by Native Hawaiians and locals alike. There's a commercial and artisanal fishing interest for it. The other is the introduced Samoan crab. Now, the reason we call it Samoan crab is because it was brought in from Samoa. But in other places in the world, they call it mud crab or mangrove crab. And as I like to tell my students, that gives you a little bit of a hint as to where you might find them. Typically, where there's mud and where there's mangroves. Now, one of the reasons why we're interested in this critter is because it actually is not very well studied. Now, we know historically a little bit about where it came from. There was a first introduction attempt in 1926, as you can see from this article on the top, Honolulu Star Bulletin. They didn't do so well, but they ended up surviving when they brought them in from Samoa. So as you can see from the article that I presented on the bottom, a good 9 years later, these crabs that were originally brought in to start a crab fishery are now deemed a menace. So they were very successful at establishing from the just shy of 100 individuals that were initially introduced, and currently they are all over the main Hawaiian Islands. Now in this box, I also have a little blurb highlighted where it says that these Samoan crabs are infesting fish ponds. They kill fish and even destroy the walls by tunneling under them. So for part one of this project, where we look at crabbing and sustainability, I call this collaborative crabbing. Now, the reason I call it that is because in order to conduct this work, we work with a number of different people from various different local or fish ponds. What we try to do at each fish pond is describe their current management efforts, characterize specifically the Samoan crab population because there are so many Samoan crabs, and then try to model sustainable crabbing practice using the data that we've gathered and the previous practices and traditional management. In order to collect data, we use consistent gear. We also track locations and how long the traps have been underwater, which is called our soak time, and we take consistent measurements. Now for this crab that I have here on the bottom with the yellow bar, that just shows you where most consistent measurement is across the back. We call that the carapace width, or the width of the crab. This is actually a standard measure across the United States. The other thing we do is we try to sex them. In other words, we try to see if they're male, female, or gravid. And if you turn them over, they actually have a very distinct shape depending on if they're male. They tend to have a more narrow region underneath, or female, very nice, big, and broad. And that's where she carries her eggs. Now, when she's carrying her eggs, it's a little bit obvious in that she carries her eggs externally underneath this flap, which is why it's so broad. So you can see from this other picture I have in the bottom corner, that's an example of what it looks like when she has fresh eggs. So to review some of the data that we have so far, what I've done here is I've just taken a small sampling of some of the data we collected at one of our fish ponds in collaboration with some of the fish pond managers. What I'm showing you here is that overall, the maximum number of crabs that we've caught in a single crabbing session is 44 individuals. Typically, we may find 3 crabs per trap, but at most we've seen at least 8 crabs in one trap. They tend to be fairly large, and even though we were able to catch so many crabs at one point, 44, the average catch is actually only, the average keep is only 7. Now the keep is based on size. So in other words, these are marketable crabs. So if they're not marketable, they go back to the pond. We have not yet found a gravid female. This could be for a number of biological reasons. Sometimes gravid females don't feed. Sometimes they are protective of their eggs, and so they will avoid other crabs. So this gives you an example of what our data looks like if we look at weight by size. So on the x-axis is the width or the size of the crab, and on the y-axis is the weight in pounds. So the whole, and then the line that I have here in the green is this shows you male maturity. So this is the size at which a male crab can now successfully produce offspring. And the blue line shows you the legal take. So anything above that line can be removed. But the whole point I want you to grab from this is that crab weight, of course, increases with size. Now this is important because size is necessary to pay attention to for legal take, but it's the weight that's important for monetary worth. So from here on out, I'll be just showing you size. So this is a box and whisker plot. So essentially what I have here is a way to show what the data look like per catch. So each date at the bottom is a single session where we went out and caught crabs. On your y-axis is the size. And essentially what you're looking at here is within this box is 75% of the crabs that we found. So what you can see from this is that the majority of the crabs that we caught sort of vary between sessions. For example, there's this one really large box here where the majority of the crabs were actually quite a bit smaller than any of the other days. These numbers here at the top also give you an idea for how many crabs total that we caught. To contextualize this a little bit more, I have these green and blue lines again. So again, the green line is to show you male maturity, the size at which he can produce offspring, and legal take. So another way of looking at this shows you that with this blue line here in place, depending on the month, the majority of the catch was not actually legal size, which means the majority of the catch went back into the fish pond. So this is sort of showing you similar information, except instead we're looking at the average size, which is in black, and then the max and min, which are the two lines above it. So here's our familiar blue and green line again, the bottom line being male maturity. And so you can see that with this, the average catch size per date was, again, under legal take. So majority of the crabs were not legal size. But this leads us to ask more questions. Now, I only showed you a snapshot in time, so we still have a lot more time to go to see if we can see any annual trends or seasonal trends. So right now we want to better understand what are population dynamics, because so far we've only been looking at crabs that we were able to catch in our traps, but there might be smaller crabs or even larger ones. I mean, it's not an exhaustive way to look at everything in the ponds. Other questions we have are, do they match other biocultural indicators? So in the Hawaiian Islands, one thing that I mentioned was seasonality, but here we look at 2 seasons instead. Ho'oilo, which is the wet season, which takes half of the year, and Kovela, which is the dry season, which takes another half of the year. So one way to better understand the catch is to look at it annually, or also to see if we can find any patterns between dry and wet seasons. We also want to be able to expand this work outside of Samoan crab, because again, they're not native to here. And also we want to find out if these crabbing populations are connected across the Pai'aina or the Hawaiian archipelago. And so for this part of the project, the second part, we are now able to include Kuahonu, which is our native crab. But what do I mean when I say connected? Well, connectivity is the exchange of individuals among geographically separated subpopulations. But what does that look like? So here, I just have a small coastline of Oahu, and I'm just giving you an example. So these little spots are areas that we could say are populations. So these are places where we might find these crabs. What I know is, are these different populations able to mate with each other and produce young? Now, one of the ways that they could do that is by actually traveling physically from these places. But you see how I have a place all the way on the east and all the way on the south. And unless these crabs can walk on land, and actually some of them can, but unless they could walk across the mountains, it's not very likely that the adults are the ones doing the transportation. It's much more likely that it's the little babies, these little larval crabs that are swimming around in the ocean that could actually get around the entire island or even across the entire island chain. So in order to do this work, what we do is we collect crab tissue from our designated populations. So just like in those circles that I showed you, we designate populations on the islands. We go out crabbing, and then we can collect crab tissue. So what we do is we take a small piece of leg. It does seem a little brutal, however, crabs do grow their legs back. And if you don't believe me, here's an example of a crab we found in the field with little tiny arm buds. So this crab was actually in the process of growing its claws back. So we do take as little tissue as possible so that the crab can be returned to the place where we got it. And the whole point of this is to scale it all the way up to inter-island connectivity. In other words, if you are collecting stock or if you're managing a stock in one place on one island, you may want to better understand, are your crabs only coming from your pond, or are they actually coming from somewhere else in the island chain? In which case that could influence the way you manage or co-manage this resource. And part of the reason why this work is important to us is that this is one way in which we can better work on integrating cultural ecological knowledge and using modern population genetics to support community and place-based management for these marine resources. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nate DeMaagd. I'm a grad student in the economics department working with Michael Roberts, who's my PhD advisor, and Danielle Spirandelli, who's in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. And what we're looking at is, I don't think my advisor will let me keep this title in the actual paper, but I have it titled Whether and Whether We Will Wallow in Water. So what we're looking at is climate change and how the consumers are going to be affected, so water consumers, how they're going to be affected by climate change. So as it gets warmer, as it gets drier, how is water consumption going to be affected? So economists love graphs, so I put up a simple one to start with. So on the horizontal axis, we have the quantity, so this is how much water is being used by the island, and the vertical axis is the price. And for the Board of Water Supply, we have a cost curve. This is how much it costs the Board of Water Supply to pump the water, to clean it, overhead costs, things like that, on average per gallon of water. And then we can combine that with the demand curve, which is given a certain price, how much water are people going to want to buy? And when we intersect those things, we figure out how much water is going to be used. So where the costs meet the demand, we have a quantity of water that's being pumped and used by consumers on the island, and the associated price. Now, the Board of Water Supply, we actually gave the same presentation, a much longer version of this presentation to the Board of Water Supply, and they had said that they're committed to keeping prices low for consumers. So they don't want to charge any more than it costs them to pump the water and everything else. And whether this is a sustainable practice or not depends on the maximum sustainable yield of our aquifers. So how much water are we using and how much is available in the aquifers is the question. So is this a sustainable practice? And well, it depends. It is sustainable if the maximum sustainable yield, which is the blue vertical line, is greater than the amount of water we're actually using now. Fortunately, if the maximum sustainable yield is, so if the aquifers aren't able to provide us enough water, or the amount of water that we're currently using, this pricing policy is not sustainable. And what we're forgetting here in this situation is the sorry, I got kind of cut off, but the resource value of this water itself. So when we're only looking at the costs, when the prices are only based off the costs that Board of Water Supply incurs, we're not taking into account the fact that water is scarce. It's something that we can run out of, and we should price it as such. So there's two big questions that are being looked at right now, and they are, how will climate change affect maximum sustainable yield? So as the climate changes, do I have an arrow? Yeah. As the climate changes, will this maximum sustainable yield change? Is it going to increase and shift beyond our needs, or is it going to decrease and we're going to have to do something, otherwise we'll run out of water? So that's a big question. The other side that our project is more focused on is, how will climate change affect demand? So how is this demand curve, how is this demand line going to shift left and right as the climate changes? So the first question was, how is maximum sustainable yield going to change? And like I said, it's going to stay the same, or it's going to increase or decrease as weather, like precipitation patterns, trade winds, things like that change. And we're leaving that to the real scientists. We're not really concerned with this question. We're going to take what they give us and come up with a policy given their results. What we're looking at, like I said, is the demand. How is that demand curve going to shift as weather becomes warmer, drier, or however it ends up happening? Now, once we want to get into the sustainable pricing, what matters is how responsive these consumers are to changes in price. So if we have a really flat or relatively flat demand curve, that means that the consumers are pretty responsive to prices. So if we increase prices even a little bit, if they're really responsive, they'll cut back on their consumption. So we won't have to, if we need to, increase prices very much to get a result that we want. On the other hand, if consumers aren't responsive to prices, we're going to have to hike the prices way up in order to reduce consumption the same amount. So there's really two parts to our project, and one is, how responsive are people to the climate? How do they adjust their water consumption as the temperature, precipitation changes? And the other part is, how responsive are they to prices? So I have it broken down in two parts. So here, climate and water use. What we did is we got very high resolution. It's a 250 meter resolution of hourly weather data for the entire island. And it's like 1990 to present. So we have a very large history of very fine grained weather information. And I won't get into too much about how we did it, but we had a bunch of weather stations throughout the island, and we were given hourly weather data, daily min and max data, and we used elevation data and things like that to interpolate between all of these points to get a temperature at every grid cell, I guess we'll call it. So after we got our weather data, we combined it with the water use data that was given to us by the Board of Water Supply. And we started looking at, this is kind of a very broad picture. So, and it's also kind of a confusing picture. So this is just so that we're just looking at Oahu. All the red dots are locations of single family homes. And the light blue lines are the rainfall contours that correspond with these contours here. I just made specific contour levels. And within each contour group, I looked at how much water people are consuming. So the people that are further up the valleys and higher areas, wetter areas, we can see that they're using less water. So here's the scale here. So it goes from about 200 to 300 gallons a day per home. And the lighter the blue of the region, the less water they use. So as we move further down the valleys, further to lower lying areas, drier areas, warmer areas, the consumption of water goes up. So I can see Mahilani's critique coming along with this slide. All I wanted to show here was, so what we were wondering is, well, maybe these houses in the warmer, drier areas are just using more water because they're larger homes, they have bigger yards, they water, irrigate more, or something like that. So all I wanted to check was to make sure that that's not the case. And so by each contour group, for each different color here, we looked at characteristics like square footage of the lot, square footage of the home, how many bedrooms they have, how many bathrooms they have. And there's really not that much of a difference from contour group to contour group. So what we did, now we're getting into a little more detail, we made a more sophisticated model that allows it's more flexible. And this is just for single family homes and how responsive they are to temperature given all of those other characteristics. So we can see in the middle, so this vertical line here is the median temperature experienced by the home. And on the vertical axis, 0 at the dotted line is the median hourly use of the home, hourly water use of the home. So when we go from -1 degree Celsius to +1 degree Celsius change, so that's increasing the temperature, there's not much of a change. So if it's a little bit warmer, people don't really respond that much. But in the extremes, when we're really warm or really cool relative to the median temperature, the consumption starts changing a lot. I mean, the error bands are large, and anytime we deal with climate change, there's a lot of uncertainty. But it looks pretty clear, at least so far, this is an ongoing project, that people do really respond to temperatures. And if the temperatures change enough with climate change, we might have to take some actions to make sure that our drawing from the aquifers is sustainable. So, like I said, in the middle, where there's not much temperature change from hour to hour, there's not much of a, we can't say with certainty that there's going to be an increase or decrease. But once we get out to the extremes, I'm also taking it out. Once we get out to the extreme temperatures, there is a pretty significant effect. I'll just skip that. So switching gears over to the price and water use. So we found out people are pretty responsive to temperatures. We did the same exact thing for precipitation, and so far we haven't found much significance. But with temperature, we're getting happier with our results. And so we're going to see how we can combine that with this, the responsiveness to price, and see what kind of sustainable policies we can come up with. So to figure out how responsive people are to prices now, we came up with a pretty, it's actually pretty simple. So if you're connected to the sewer system, you pay for your water and your sewer. But if you're on a cesspool, you only pay the sewer port, or not the sewer, you pay the water service. So people on sewer use less water because they have to pay a much higher bill. and the people on cesspools pay hardly anything for water, so they use a lot. So we found these two groups that are pretty similar, and we're going to match them together household to household to see how much the difference in water use is based off of how different their bills are. So here's a quick graph showing how much difference there is between users. So sewer people, the numbers that really matter are down here. On average, people on sewer connections use 240 gallons a day, and then people on cesspools use 290 gallons a day. And the difference in their total bill, which is the box plots on the right, is pretty significant. People on cesspools each month pay average $30 a month for their water, and then people on sewers pay that extra sewer charge, so they're paying about $130 a month. So we have these let's do this. So we have these two groups, the sewer people and the cesspool people, and what we want to do is connect the dots to estimate that demand curve, and how steep that is will tell us how responsive these people are to prices. So sorry again, but what we did it a few different ways, but the best one, our best result is this. I don't know my arrows. Here it is. This bottom is this what we're calling our matching method. So within each census tract, so we divided the entire island up into these census tracts, so they're like really small neighborhoods, maybe a few blocks each. And we found one person with a cesspool and one person with a sewer. So everyone with a cesspool got matched with the closest person with a sewer. So they had the same square footage, the same number of bedrooms, all of that. The only difference was that one was on sewer, one was on cesspool. And we did that as much as we could. And we found that people on cesspools use about 10% more water than people on relatively similar people on sewer connections. And the elasticity, meaning how responsive these people are to prices, was about negative 0.14. And what that means is if we double the prices of water, the consumption will decrease by 14%. So that's not that much of that's pretty insensitive, but it's still significant. So we can still maybe affect water use by adjusting prices if we need to. So this is where we start combining them. So we combine the temperature response with the price response, and given a range of maximum sustainable yields. So like I said, we're not the ones looking at what the ultimate sustainable draw from our aquifers is, but given a range, we can figure out what the cost per gallon should be so that we can sustainably draw. So right now, with the current pricing, we figured that we can sustainably draw about 93 million gallons a day from our aquifers. If our maximum sustainable yield turns out to be larger than this, then, so say maybe we find out that the maximum sustainable yield could be 110 gallons per day, then we can reduce the price and we would still have enough money, or we would still have enough water to sustainably draw from the aquifers. And there comes a point where even if we offered water for free, which we'll never do, but if we did, the maximum sustainable yield could be so large that we still wouldn't use enough water to unsustainably draw from it. And unfortunately, I don't think we're moving in that direction. We're probably moving in the other direction where we'll have a lower maximum sustainable yield in the future. So we might have to use this price response to know how to adjust prices so that we can stay on this line. So like I said, consumption may rise or the maximum sustainable yield may fall over time, and we may have to increase prices as a result so that we can sustainably draw from our aquifers. And then this is our final slide here. On the right, we have the total increase in temperature. So 0 would be today's temperature. And then over time, I think the projection right now is, or the hope is to limit it to a 2-degree increase. And the line tells us how much water is going to be used as that temperature rises. So for the first So for the first 2 degrees, there's a lot of uncertainty. We might have an increase in consumption as a result of increasing temperatures, but we really only see that significant increase in consumption when temperatures start rising a lot. So that final one is 3 degrees, which is about a temperature change of 6 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a pretty large change for an average yearly temperature increase. And then on the bottom, we have how much we need to adjust the prices to keep consumption at the current level, given those increases in temperatures. So for instance, if for some reason over the next 100 years or so, the temperature does increase by 3 degrees, what the bottom line tells us is how much prices will have to be increased to keep consumption at its current levels. And it's a pretty large increase. And Board of Water Supply is really looking to not do this. They want to look at other conservation measures instead of prices, because when you start adjusting prices, you're really hurting different groups of people. So they don't want to do this yet, but we have the information for them if they want it. And yeah, this is just what I said. So for small changes, small increases in temperature, there's a lot of uncertainty. But for large increases in temperature, it's pretty sure that consumption will go up, and so a sustainable price will also go up. And that's all I have. Thank you. And Mel's going to talk about seawalls.
Hi, my name is Mel Lorenzo Accad. So I hope you're still having fun tonight. So I'm going to talk about beaches and shorelines. And this is very crucial for an island economy like Hawaii, because we depend on tourism, we depend on the beaches, we depend on the scenery of the ocean. So I'm going to talk about to you about how these beaches get eroded because of the human responses to sea level rises. So our research question is very simple. It's just, do seawalls lower property values? So it's a very simple but very crucial for an island economy like Hawaii. So I'm working with Arlen Brucal, who is in London School of Economics, also with Professor John Lineham of Department of Economics of UH Manoa, and I'm Mel Lorenzo Accad, PhD economics student. So why is it so important to look at economics and its relationship with the environment? One thing is that we have to figure out what are the human decision-making processes that affects our environment, and that is, and for this case, is the seawall construction. So what are the causes of beach recession? One is the sea level rise. As shown in this graph by several studies done in the past, there has been a very dramatic increase in the sea level rise since 1860s until 2010. So if you look at the first 50 years, there is an increase of about 100 millimeters. That's around 100 millimeters. So it's important to see that because of this sea level rise that causes beach recession, or we're losing the beaches. Another cause is natural weathering, and then there's this geography. And then the most crucial one is the human causes. One is the seawall construction. So that's why economic aspect of this environmental problem is important, because this is caused by humans. So to give you an example, this is an aerial image of a shoreline. You can see here that there's a stone revetment over here, which was constructed maybe before 1967. And on the neighboring side, you can see that there's a greenery, and then there's a beach, and then there's a water. As we move on from 1967 to 1995, you can see that there's a huge disparity in terms of this beach width. So from here to here, the water have risen. You can see the water have risen from here to here. So you can see that there is a beach loss. So another thing is that when one house constructs a seawall over here, it's gonna increase the rate of beach width recession of its neighbor. So there's a 6-meter beach width difference here. And as seawalls were constructed as a based on human decision making. So as a neighbor to us, as a neighbor of these house, I would rather set up a seawall on my own because my beach is receding. So we saw that in 2000, the neighbor created its own seawall to protect itself from the recession. So there is these like responses. So 1967, they don't have a seawall, but in 2000, they already have a seawall here. So there is this response, like a race to set up seawalls because of the recession. And this is aggravated by sea level rise. So according to several studies, one is by our own Romain and Fletcher. So there's about 11%, plus minus 4% of nearly all documented beach loss was fronting an armored or fronting a seawall. So among these armored beach, 72% of them degraded, while 43% of them narrowed, and 28% of them significantly, and 29% of them have completely lost to erosion. So this is a very crucial issue in Hawaii because beaches are so important and it's crucial to its economy. So the motivation here is to see the race towards more construction, seawall construction in Hawaii because of that, because of the sea level rise. So as economists, we're looking at prices. That's how we deal with the valuations of things. So looking at this figure, you can see that the seawalls in the neighborhood will drive beach recession and aesthetics deterioration. And this aesthetics deterioration, beach recession, will cause changes in property prices in the shorelines. So to give you a take-home jargon here, I'm giving you one economic jargon which is called externality. It's about uncompensated cost if it's a negative externality, or it's an uncompensated benefit if it's positive externality from a private action that is unintentionally imposed on others. So setting up a seawall will impose a negative externality on your neighbor. That's the main idea here. And then another main point here is that human responses may be privately optimal. You would set up your own seawall to protect your own property, but it is socially suboptimal, meaning it's against your neighbor to put up your own seawall because you will erode your neighbor's beaches. So to give you some numbers, so these, if you look at here, so what we did in our studies to include houses within 200 feet away from the seawalls, and then looking at 300 feet away from the seawalls until 500 feet away from the seawalls. So we got a measurement of the proportion of the coastal line. We have the proportion that is having a seawall here. So as we look at the houses near the seawall, there is an increase in the property values of 3%. So here, 3.8%. Whereas if we include more houses in the neighborhoods, the effect becomes negative, meaning there's a reduction of 3% of the total of all the house prices in that neighborhood. And as we move further until 500 feet, there's a negative 4% reduction in the property values due to the seawall in that neighborhood. So you can see here that so a narrowing beach width will cause a negative 30% or around 27% on the property prices. And then these change rate, meaning the increase or the narrowing of the shoreline, will surely decrease the value of the property. So that's the main point here. So the conclusion is that shoreline recession reduces property values by around 20%, and seawall construction is socially costly. That's it. Thank you.
Great. So can I ask the graduate trainees to come up here for our Q&A? Does anyone have any questions for our graduate trainees?
Yes, I'd like to hear more, less about the economics of the water and the purity, because I realize that our aquifers are in danger from the illegal storage containers, and that's my answer. So the question is, what is this something that you're studying also?
The water quality aspect of it? No, we haven't looked at the quality at all yet. So when we're talking about maximum sustainable yield and things like that, we're looking at purely just the head levels of the aquifer. We're not looking at like saltwater intrusion, so salinity changes, or like you said, oil issues or anything like that.
But it's to my understanding that you are.
It's regarding the seawall. What happens if everybody puts up a seawall versus nobody puts up a seawall? Is the erosion still occurring?
According to the Rowling-Fletcher study, there's a very high certainty that it's gonna erode the beaches. And what's happening is that this is uncoordinated. Like one house will put up a seawall, and then there's an erosion in the neighborhood, and then your neighbor will set up a seawall, and then your neighbor's neighbor will set up a seawall, and it's uncoordinated. So there's a faster way of recession because of that. So the best way is not to have a seawall. That's based on the scientific side of natural science side. But in terms of economics, there has to be a certain level of control on setting up these seawalls. So I guess that's the answer. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Because I don't know the definition of beach erosion. Do you have any pictures to show the beach erosion so we get an idea what we're talking about?
Yep. Sure. So this one is a
much easier picture. Because I don't know if the beach erosion is the beach is disappearing or the guy's property is disappearing. I'm not sure what we're talking about. So do you have any pictures to just pictures, or just tell me what it means, beach erosion?
Yeah.
Beach recession.
Yeah. So there's this called flanking. So the sands are totally gone, and then the water is coming in the property. And then there's this beach recession, which is just, so by definition, we look at the low water mark and this vegetation. So that's the beach width. That's our definition of beach width. The sun is the white thing. Yeah.
Vegetation is
just this is the vegetation.
Okay, so if you have beach recession,
yeah.
What happens to the line of the vegetation?
So because of sea level rise, usually these are eroded too. So
that's flooding.
Yeah. So there may be a recession of the vegetation or a cession of the water due to sea level rise. So these low water mark would go up. That's a beach recession, or this vegetation goes here. So that's also a beach recession. Oh, yeah. So if this vegetation goes here, while the low water mark is still here, you have a beach accession. So there's a longer beach. But if the low water mark is going up also, while this vegetation is also going up, there may not be a change in the beach width. Or if this stays the same while the low water mark goes up, you have a beach recession. That's how we define it and measure it.
Yes.
Let's talk about
Crabs.
when the eggs hatch.
Mhm.
Larval form is pelagic.
Mhm.
How long?
So the larval stage being pelagic depends on the species. So they actually spend a number of different stages planktonic. So the form that I had showed you in the slides was very, very early. They barely even look like a crab at that point. They kind of look like an insect. And one of the features of it, well, let's see if we can get to it. One of the features is that adaptations for being able to swim. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a late stage. So this is the stage before it's ready to settle down to become an adult. Has this big wide flap here, so it uses it as a tail. It can swim around. For some of the species, it can be really quick. It can be a few weeks. For some species, it can be really long. It can be months. For things like lobsters, which are actually pretty siller, they can spend up to a year. So it just kind of depends on the species for how long they're in this stage as these little creatures.
So, like Samoan crab, do you know how long?
For Samoan crab, I think it's a few months. Now, the reason why I said I think, yeah, the reason I said I think is because a lot of the research that we're using to understand the biology of this critter actually comes from places outside of Hawaii. So we don't have any basic biology knowledge from the islands. We're using a lot of information from the Indo-Pacific and other places where these guys are found. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up on Samoan crab. At what month do we have a larval stage for when the eggs hatch? What month of the year?
So that also is a little bit regional dependent, but since we're in the mid-tropic area, so far we haven't really seen major fluctuations. So to contrast that, if you've ever heard of Dungeness crab in the Pacific Northwest, they have very strong seasonality where in the springtime, you'll see a lot of babies wash up on shore. But throughout the year, you won't really see that. But in the tropics, we don't really see that. So you can see the larvae coming in various times throughout the year.
One more for me.
Okay, and then we'll go to you. Okay.
Ned, could you put up the slide temperature effect?
This one.
The temperature effect. Now, we have the temperature on the x-axis.
Yes.
And we have the hourly use on the y-axis. But you also have the gallonage. So what were you using for an hourly rate of use of, so you can get the gallonage? What formula, what rule are you using? If that's the hourly rate, you're going to get the gallons from it, right?
Yes.
So how do you get the gallons from?
So how is our data comes from Board of Water Supply, and it gives us monthly billing data that tells us how much water they used in the month in gallons.
Yeah, on the axis is hourly.
So
And then in parentheses is.
this is,
They tell you how many hours is used. How do you figure the gallonage?
so we have the billing start date and end date and how much water they use. So we figured out how much they used per day and then per hour just from that.
So
So
you use the gallonage they give you, and you figure the hours?
We figured out how much they used per hour based off of the length of the billing period and how much water they used in the month.
And, you know, some people can cost you can have a drip, you can have a little bit, you can have a big amount, you can have a flooding. So when you go by hours, you have to use something to get the gallons. Or if you got the gallons, you've got to get something to get the hours.
Well, this is just gallons per month divided by number of hours in the billing period. So it's an average number of gallons used per hour.
So it's not an actual amount, it's just a statistic that they use.
It's
Gallons divided by, it's not an actual gallon.
so it's gallons.
He's telling you.
It's average gallons per hour is the units.
That says hourly use, and you have gallons. So there's two different things here. Hourly use is time. And you have gallons, which is not time. So I'm asking, how do you make the connection between the two? You have to have a rule or something, or a formula.
Maybe I'm not explaining it well, but we just have the total amount of gallons they used. Right.
Okay, now,
So if we're told that they used 1,000 gallons in the month, we divide 1,000 by the number of hours in the billing period over the month.
it's basically, it's not even hours. It's just gallons you should be out there.
Yeah, gallons per
How many
hour.
hours they used it, you're just guessing in the whole month.
So
I'm just making a straight division. And you're getting a value, and that's what you're saying, that's the use.
right. So this is an estimate.
I thought you guys were actually measuring it. I thought the water supply was actually measuring stuff. If they got the gallons, then why don't you just put gallons up and forget the hours?
Because we wanted to see how this is, so our weather data is in hours, so we had to match it somehow. So,
Sorry if I'm getting you.
no, it's okay. So to match the units for the temperatures, we convert everything to hourly usage.
Basically, you say the hotter it gets, the more gallons you use.
Yes. So what this graph specifically says is if you have a house that experiences 1 degree warmer than usual in a particular hour, then how is the water use in that hour going to change? So if it's warmer than usual, it might go up. They might use 1 or 2 more gallons in that hour if it's 1 or 2 degrees warmer. And then that's spread across the entire month.
Crabs. Okay.
So each stage, like an outlet.
They don't have an nuclei. No, that's specific to barnacles.
So different parts of our station. They're all different minerals regarding each species, or they're different parts different that they are collected.
Yeah, so I'm actually not a larval biologist, but from what I understand with some of the work that we've been doing, so one of the things that we look at is that different species can be defined by different numbers of stages per big stage. So for example, like the megalope, which is the last stage we had, the late larval stage, some species might have 3 stages in it, some might have 5. But the number of like sub-stages they have may or may not influence how much longer they spend as larvae. Does that answer your question? Okay.
One more question.
Section. In California, which I assume other places, huge difference.
Yep.
In the amount of sand piled up on beach in summer compared to.
Yep.
Here we might expect something similar being reversed on North Shore and South Shore.
Mhm.
Where the swells come from.
Yep.
That factor part what you have to do.
Oh, seasons. So we're looking at annual data. So the intra-year variation would not be incorporated in our result. But what I can tell you is that there's a difference across shorelines. This is the south, this is the east, and this is the west. So these numbers are with respect to the North Shore. So the South Shore has a 2% more than the North Shore in terms of value in terms of house prices. So there's a 22% increase if you have a seawall in front of your house. For those in the south, and then for those who are in the east, it's a reduction in the property prices compared to the northern shore. And then also for the west shore, it's 28% decrease in the property values compared to the north shore. So we have variation across shores here. So the north, yeah. Oh, seasonal, yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting question. We could do that by having an intra-year observations, but this is a aggregated level to the annual data, so we cannot see the variation within the year. Yeah. So we're looking at from 1950 to 2005 in this study.